Time now to see what's making headlines around the world. Solange Moujon joining us once again in the studio. Solange, no surprise, you're beginning with our top story here live from Paris. These images of the riots at the U.S. Capitol on Wednesday and this pro-Trump mob storming the building.
Yeah, and it's pretty much scrawled across the pages of the world's papers. There's a lot of outrage, there's a lot of shock and sadness. Let's start with the Swiss paper Le Temps. It headlines with La blessure, or the wound. And it writes that what's happened in Washington is that American democracy is hitting rock bottom, a shipwreck of sorts, they say. Or a horror movie, if you go with what L'Opinion, the French paper, is calling Donald Trump's instigation of the mob that stormed the Capitol. And they wonder how the U.S. ended up here. In their cartoon by Cac, he's been inspired by The Shining. Instead of Jack Nicholson, it is Donald Trump using an axe on Lady Liberty. Now, this movie theme is also being picked up by Libération, the French paper, went with the headline, Very Bad Trip. This is a reference to the French title, actually, of the movie Hangover. Now, on an analytical level, the paper argues that against people saying that this was an un-American event. Actually, Libération says that violence is very much, they think, a part of the ethos of U.S. culture. An opinion that they provide a caveat to, though, saying that such attacks on democracy can happen pretty much anywhere.
Yeah, and that's a point picked up by other papers, is that even though we haven't seen this sort of thing in America before, it does happen in other countries.
Yeah, and as we can see in the Orlando Sentinel, this is being picked up in U.S. local media as well. They cover politicians saying, quote, this is third world style anti-American anarchy, end quote. But The Guardian, the British paper, says that the beast of battle here is not anarchy, but the far right, that it is indeed growing across the globe. It says that it is high noon that we recognize the rise of the far right and, quote, take it for what it is, a threat to liberal democracy. Now, the problem, according to the New Yorker, is that people have too long laughed off Donald Trump and his supporters as being ridiculous, when in fact they can be, as we saw in Washington, a very real threat.
And anytime you have an unprecedented event, there's always time to reflect about how it could be prevented in the future and how it could also be covered by the media.
Yeah, there's a lot of analysis going on about how security forces were not prepared enough. And 538, the polling site, argues that statistically, police intervene twice as much at left-wing protests as they do with right-wing ones. And the problem, therefore, is that this was a right-wing protest. So the issue here, they say, is not only racial, but political and ideological on behalf of the police and on behalf of politicians. Now, as for how the press covers this unrest and how it is covering it, in the conversation, a journalist professor argues that U.S. media actually took a novel approach here. Many covered the events in ways that they are not used to, using terms like insurrection, riot, siege, and mob. And that she argues that showing such violence only lasted a little while, though, on conservative media outlets, that they quickly reframed the narrative, she says, of the impact of such undemocratic actions by pulling these images and the violence of these images from these right-wing media sources, that they chose the narrative of out of sight, out of mind rather quickly.
Solange, you also found that some countries have been looking at Wednesday's events to find how they can push their own non-democratic agenda.
Yeah, let's talk about China for a bit and how the Chinese press is covering this story. The pro-government Global Times, it says what happened here, quote, was not a farce incited by Trump, but the internal collapse of the U.S. political system, end quote. Now, according to the more editorially free, let's say, South China Morning Post, commentators and Chinese media have been quick to compare Washington with Hong Kong and portraying pro-democracy protesters there as the same kind of threat as the Trump rioters. But the paper says that the two are not comparable, that one group is fighting an end to autocracy by taking siege of local governments, and the other is doing the opposite, following a leader who wants to break apart a democracy.
And meanwhile, calls in the United States for Donald Trump to be removed from office are growing louder.
Yeah, Der Tagesspiegel, the German paper, has the Statue of Liberty with her hands over her face today, and it argues that the Trump presidency cannot go on a day longer. And that's actually a plea that's coming from, perhaps surprisingly, the conservative paper, the Wall Street Journal. Its editorial board argues that the best course of action here is for Donald Trump to right now, quote, take responsibility and resign, end quote, so as to avoid a second impeachment or the invoking of the 25th Amendment, stripping of his powers, which leads me to end with a cartoon. This is from the Washington Post, a little cartoon that has Donald Trump in a straitjacket with 25th Amendment written on his back, sort of stripping him of his presidency as soon as possible, that its time is up for him.
All right. Thank you very much, Solange Moujon, with a look at what's making headlines. Time now for a quick break, and then we'll be back here at Live from Paris with more news coming up.